Alright guys, gonna make a video about hunting knives. Just sort of go over some of the stuff that I've used in the past, notes I've made about how that stuff worked, and how all of that culminated in me making a purchase decision recently to get something that I viewed as at least being potentially optimal for my uses. So, first of all, just to get definitions straight, what I mean by hunting knife is a knife that will be used for field dressing, white-tailed deer, as well as skinning them, and to some extent doing the butchering work as well. Although the butchering work could be done by, as my uncle does it, actual butcher's knives. He, was a chef for many years, professional chef, and he's got, an assortment of decent actual meat processing blades, like specifically a boning knife, and then a butcher's knife, and like actual meat processing blades like that. And those are what you would consider to be optimal for actual meat processing work. I just like to use these knives for that, really as an experiment, just for the sake of using them. But in any case, that's what I mean by hunting knife, a knife that is used for field dressing, skinning, and butchering white-tailed deer, which white-tailed deer in the area that I hunt at typically weigh anywhere from, for say like a 2 or 3 year old doe, which is on the small side of the animals, they might weigh between, on average at least, between say 125, 130 pounds up to maybe 160. Large ones can get up into the 180 range, but that's fairly uncommon. And when they do weigh that much, it's usually because it's an older doe that was barren, did not give birth, and they're heavily laden with fat. You can find fat reserves across the back that are up to 2 inches thick. But bucks typically weigh, a mature buck typically weighs anywhere from about 175 to 225, sometimes more, sometimes a bit less, but usually that's the weight range, is about 175 to 225. So that's the sort of size of the animals. Now, this is a buck 119 special. Unless you're just completely unfamiliar with knives, you'll probably recognize this. It's kind of one of the quintessential classic American deer hunting knives. This was what I used for the first, probably 6-7 years, something like that, before I started experimenting with other stuff. The main problem that I have with this knife is that the relatively long blade of 6 inches combined with this top guard mean that my hand, it's hard to maintain good control over the tip, simply because of how far away the tip is from my thumb and stuff. It'd be a little bit easier to deal with if I could just go like this, which I guess you kind of can, but it's not particularly comfortable because of that guard. So there's sort of one end, 428C, there's sort of one end of the size spectrum. I used this for 1 year, 1 season. This is a Kershaw, I believe it's called the Big Rock Hunter. This was mainly an experiment in the gut hook, as well as just a somewhat shorter blade. And what I found is that I don't like gut hooks. I'll just kind of keep it short and simple and say that it tends to get caught on things when you're inside the animal doing various cuts, and actually using it for what it's intended, opening the animal, I found to be somewhat awkward and dangerous and kind of weird. So gut hooks are kind of a no-go for me. I don't particularly care for that. You can see there's still blood and hair on this. perhaps not the most sanitary thing in the world, but whatever. Uh, and then, I did use this for 1 year as well. This is a 5-inch kitchen utility knife made by Joe Kelton. This was gifted to me by Chad Englehart. Excellent knife, by the way. $10.95. This was an experiment in really in sort of two things. One, there's really not much of a guard on this handle. I would call this more of an indexing point than an actual guard, because you can quite easily come up and over this. But you can feel when your finger is on it, so it kind of just lets you know that your finger is fairly close to the edge. Excuse me. So that was an experiment in that, and also there's not a ton of belly to this. The point is fairly low in relation to the center line of the blade, and generally that's sort of frowned upon for hunting knives. A lot of people say you want a huge, sweeping belly. Well, I decided to kind of test that out for myself and just see what happens when I use a knife like this. And what I found was that I do prefer some sort of at least a minimal finger guard, because some of the cuts that you have to make, you can't quite see what you're doing. It's more of a feel thing, and in those situations, I really prefer to have something solid that my finger can't go up and over. And also, about the belly, it is much better to have sort of a large upsweep. The point on this knife, it was quite easy to rake the point through, which you don't always want to do. You can use it. I used it. It worked. I got the job done just fine. But I wouldn't pick this for a dedicated hunting knife, because the point is so low that when you're trying to do cuts with the tip of the knife to sort of separate various parts of the animal, it can be pretty easy to poke the tip through and score things that are on the other side. So yeah, there's one instance or one tool that I've used. And this is what I've used for the past 3 years. This is a Knives of Alaska Trekker Series elk hunter in D2. This was an experiment in three things. What do I get when I have extreme precision and control over the cutting edge? If you compare this, it's got this excellent long run of jimping. This is very much like a Spyderco type jimping, where it's that sort of fine, sharp checkering, or serrations, I don't know what you call it, but what do I get when I have extreme control over the knife, as opposed to something like this that I was talking about earlier, where you got such a long blade and then a guard up here that really prevents you from having sort of a consistent, comfortable, secure, precise control over the tip of the knife. This is kind of the opposite, where the blade is almost half as long, and you can get, because of the jimping and the handle design, you can get very, very high control, scalpel-like precision over the edge. So that's one question, is what does that level of control give me? The other question was, how short of a blade can I get away with? This is only about a 3.5-inch blade, which is significantly shorter than what I've used in the past. And is that going to be a problem, was essentially my question. And then also, what do I get when I go to a higher wear-resistant steel? Everything that I had used in the past was basically low to no carbide. Well, not no carbide. Even 1095 is going to have some cementite in it, even when it's properly hardened like that, just because there's more carbon than you need to actually form martensite in the knife. But anyway, those are basically low carbide steels. What do I get when I go to a higher carbide, high wear-resistant steel like this D2? Will I actually see a benefit, or will it just be a sort of a pain in the butt to sharpen? Excuse me. So what do I get when I do all that? And I guess the way that worked out was that while it is very nice to have that scalpel like precision and control over the cutting edge and the tip, I do prefer a significantly longer blade than this for two specific cuts. Um, I won't really bore you with the details of the two cuts. That would, take 5-10 minutes to explain. But suffice it to say that despite the extreme control over this, I am willing to give up some level of control like that and some level of precision in order to have a longer blade, because there's two cuts that need to be made that are really just a chore with a blade this short. And yeah, so there's one point. Excuse me. And on the steel, I have seen a benefit to this this D2. Right now, this is sharpened off of a DMT fine, which, a little bit of pressure and it's not sliding on my fingertips at all. It wants to start cutting, so it's quite sharp right now, smoothly shaving and that sort of thing. But if you sharpen this on something like that DMT fine or say a Spyderco medium rod, and you're willing to use this to a fairly low level of sharpness, this could be used for a long time. Excuse me, before needing to be sharpened. I have field dressed one deer, skinned two deer, and butchered two deer with the same edge on this knife. Excuse me. And after all of that work, it was still capable of sort of roughly scrape shaving my sort of coarse leg hair. My leg hair is, if you look at my arm hair, it's quite fine. My leg hair is significantly coarser. It's almost like beard hair compared to this. And this could still sort of scrape shave that leg hair, which after all that work, working on a cutting board, sort of, cutting lightly into bone, pushing it through cartilage, that kind of thing. I'd never seen that level of edge retention with these sort of lower carbide, less wear-resistant steels. So I did see a benefit in going to this, and I do enjoy that because while sure you could carry sharpening stuff, like, I could just put this medium Spyderco rod, wrap it in a little plastic bag or something like that and bring it with me, and then with something like that 420HC, it's extremely easy to resharpen, you know what I mean? You could just do two light high angle passes and then about 5 passes per side at that 15 to 20 degree angle, and it's extremely sharp again. However, I don't really like to have to do that, simply because I don't want to grind that knife while there's blood all over it, and sometimes in field conditions I don't have sort of the ability to really clean the edge, and I don't want to get blood all over this, and it's kind of it's just another thing to mess around with. So I would prefer something that just stays sharp for the duration, and this does do that. So there was sort of my conclusion on that, was that I would actually like to have a sort of more wear-resistant steel like that for the work that I'm doing. And in case you guys are curious as to whether it might be wear resistance or hardness that's doing that, because it could just be the case that this D2 is harder than this stuff, that's not the case. This is excuse me, this is claimed to be 59 to 61, I believe, so right around 60 Rockwell. I've checked hardness on Buck 420HC, and it tends to be about 59 to 60 Rockwell. And then Joe's blade here is harder than this. This is probably around 63, maybe 64. And, this still stays sharp for longer than this, partly because it does have a bit more corrosion resistance, just a bit, than this 1095. But Regardless, this stays sharper than these, so I thought it would be wise to get another, sort of relatively high carbide steel like that. I don't need S90V or S110V or something crazy like that, but something in that sort of moderate to high carbide class would probably be a good choice for me. Now, all of that having been said, what that led me to purchase was a cold steel Outdoorsman. What we have here is a 6-inch blade that is a continuous curve. It doesn't quite look like it maybe down in here, but it is a continuous curve along the entire cutting edge. It's got jimping up here that I would consider, pretty close to optimal, in the sense that if you're not putting any real pressure on it, it's more just tactile. Sort of you kind of know where your thumb is placed, but if you bear down on it, it's quite grippy, almost to the point of being painful. Actually, so that might actually be a minor issue in the future. But so you've got jimping, you've got an excellent guard here. This is very minimal in terms of like size, but it's still strongly shaped enough and sort of long enough to prevent your finger from riding up over that. And it's also extremely well rounded and buffed. It's all the edges are just melted smooth and soft. It's very comfortable, very, very comfortable. And then the handle itself is long, neutral, and rubbery, which I believe I did put oil on this, and in oily grips it does tend to get somewhat slippery. I was actually kind of surprised by that, but with oil on it, it does get a little slippery, but it's not too big of a deal because the handle is still so long that, and sort of like, I don't know, the shape of it, there's enough handle there to where even though it is a little slippery, I could still use this pretty securely. So that's one point. I can use it in an edge up grip like this for opening up the animal. I can use it in, of course, a saber grip. Hammer grips are very comfortable. The edge is close to the end of the handle. It's not too far away. Hammer grips are, comfortable, usable. Saber grips are very comfortable and usable. It's just, I like neutral handles because I can kind of use the knife however I need to, and it's not very restrictive. And this is about a 5-inch handle, so it's got plenty of length, even for my somewhat large hands. So that was very good. The blade shape looks excellent. You can see, in comparison to Joe's knife, what I was talking about earlier with the sort of the height of the point. Look at how much farther ahead the point is on that cold steel. It's way higher up. So that even if you're cutting at sort of a negative angle to the material, your odds of pushing the point through something are fairly low. So there's that. And the steel, this is cladded or laminated VG10, which is not as wear resistant as this, but I'm okay with that in this instance because I believe that the stain resistance, coupled with being able to sharpen this to a slightly lower edge angle than I can with that rather obtuse grind on this, if I can get this to sharpen to actually apex at about 15 degrees, or between 10 and 15 degrees per side, that lower edge angle combined with the stainless properties of VG10 over the sort of more corrosion prone D2, I'm sure you could see on this I've actually had what is kind of a patina on it. That should make it equal or exceed the wear resistance of that. And regardless, it's going to be more wear resistant still than some of these simpler steels. So I was perfectly fine with VG10 as a. It's quite sharp right now. As a steel choice for this. Now you can see these kind of weird looking so what I've been doing is uh, grinding down or planing down the primary grind, and eventually I'm going to fully zero this. You can see the edge bevel is a bit wider on this side than it is on this side. But my goal is to give this a full zero. And the reason for that is not so much for cutting ability, because in this instance, for meat cutting, you don't really need an especially thin knife to cut well, because meat is fairly soft and it tends to kind of separate on its own. So you don't need super high, you don't need, you don't need super thin edges to cut well. I really want to zero this mainly just for ease of sharpening, and so that I can consistently get that low, 10 to 15 degree apex on it. And I believe my, sort of current hypothesis is that if I can do that, if I zero this out, if I zero this out and use a low sharpening angle like that, this should certainly stay sharp enough for more than enough time, more than enough sort of amount of work, despite the fact that it's slightly lower wear resistant than the D2. Yeah, so the knife itself, out of the box, this had the edge angle was about 12 to 17 or so degrees per side. It kind of varied a lot, and I'll get into why I think that was the case in a minute. The edge angle kind of varied, but on average it was right around 15 degrees per side for the entire length. And the edge thickness, with the exception of this little, maybe half-inch down here, and then about like a half-inch up by the tip, the main body of the blade was 25 thou thick. So if you consider the fact that it's a fairly low edge angle at about 15 degrees per side and a 25 thou thick edge, this actually had pretty high cutting ability out of the box. It wasn't bad. It was in the same class as sort of stuff like this, and the rest of these, where it's fairly thin edge, which is good. But I wanted it to be a lot thinner, simply to reduce sharpening time and allow me to use very low edge angles. I measured the primary grind initially at about 7 degrees per side, but of course it is a hollow grind, so obviously technically, down here it's somewhat lower than that because of the, the curvature of the thing. But if I fully zero this, it's going to be at about, say 6 to 7 degrees per side, I think. Excuse me. Which is actually funny enough, that's actually still high enough where I could probably sharpen it fully at that angle, and I don't think I would run into any real durability concerns unless I was doing something like hacking into bone, which leads me to this bone breaker here. A lot of people might think that this is a gimmick, right? Like, you sort of non-hunter types might look at that and be like, or even some hunters might look at that and be like, oh, it's just a gimmick. It's just kind of, it's not really useful. But I have to say, it is not uncommon to have guys use their hunting knife to try to chop through the pelvic bone on deer. And if you're talking about a knife like this that has a fairly thin and acute edge on a hollow grind, on a not especially good steel for chopping, VG10, I would not want to use VG10 on a chopping blade, because if you do get damage, it's not likely to be stuff like simple impaction or a little bit of rolling. It's probably going to chip because it's somewhat brittle compared to even something like this. It's somewhat brittle, so I would not want to do that. And if you handed this knife the way it was in the box to your average hunter, and they sort of put a say like a 20 degree per side edge bevel on it, that's going to make the edge essentially invulnerable, and then you're leaving it on this fairly thin hollow grind, and a hollow grind um, actually increases the sort of lateral forces that are put on a blade. Uh, so if you were to hand this to somebody and they started using what is a knife with fairly high cutting ability, if they were to put a sort of obtuse edge angle on it and then try to chop through bone, if they did experience any damage, it's very likely that it would be a ripple in the primary grind, which you obviously do not want. So the addition of this bone breaker might sound kind of, gimmicky and kind of weird, but I have to tell you, I'm gonna try this out. Uh, it's it is I really think it's an actual meaningful addition to the knife. I don't think that it's something that's just a gimmick or just something that's kind of goofy and cold steely mall ninja. It's really, I think it's a smart inclusion on the design. And what this is a 25 degree per side edge bevel that's put directly onto the full thickness of the stock. It's a 190 thou stock, and it's a full, uh, you know, Scandi grind type thing where it's just an edge bevel directly on that full stock thickness. Um, and oddly enough, this was actually fully sharpened from the factory. There was a burr along this. I'll see if I can. You can kind of see where the light's reflecting there by my thumb. That portion is the only portion that wasn't fully apexed. There was actually a burr on this, which I wiped off, and right now it's not particularly sharp because I planed the edge down a bit with a 1000 grit Nanawa Superstone, which doesn't leave you with a ton of sharpness, although it still is scrape shaving sharp on my leg hair. You can actually cut like printer paper with this right now, but it'll leave it nice and durable for the chopping stuff. It should be a bit more durable than of course, than having a big burr on here. But I don't know. I think it's an interesting and thoughtful addition to the knife. Overall, the only immediate concern was that I did notice that when I was doing the sharpening and grinding on this, if you get water in here or oil in here, it does tend to kind of migrate under the handle material. But that's probably not too big of a deal, especially considering that the outer cladding on this is some kind of 400 or 420 series, sort of highly corrosion resistant steel like that. So I don't think it's too big of a deal, but that's kind of the only thing that concerned me a little bit. But overall, I think this is going to be extremely nice to work with, especially once I fully zero it. Now, what I was talking about earlier with the edge angle, the reason that I think it's variable, or it was variable before right now I have this at about 15 degrees per side even across the entire length of the blade on both sides of the blade. And then I'm using that edge angle or that edge bevel as my sort of visual indication of how far along my zeroing is coming. But from the box, it was kind of variable. It wasn't even from side to side, and it changed a little bit. And I think the reason why is because there is no straight portion on this knife. The edge curves all the time, which actually is going to make this a pretty good cutter, because you kind of, on a draw cut, you have a constant radius that's putting quite high pressure on a small area, or on a deeper cut through meat, it's sort of sweeping through in that constant motion type of thing, as opposed to something with a straighter edge where your pressures might be a little bit lower, because it's distributing the force over that longer surface area. And I think that's why this was somewhat uneven, because in all fairness to the guys that grind these, or maybe ladies, I don't know, I would think this would be pretty difficult to sharpen. So, with respect to that, I think they did a halfway decent job because it's not an easy blade shape to work with. One interesting thing is that if you look at the way that I've planed this down, it's quite clear that the primary grind varies in thickness. I polished these flats that I made with, lightly polished them with that Superstone 1000. But for instance, down here, the grind is a little bit thicker, and then it thickens out up here too to the point where there's really almost no hollow left at the very tip. So I anticipate that when I fully zero this, you'll be able to see a line like that extends and continues right through here. Right now you can kind of see it's part way out into the blade. But yeah, let me think. The method that I've been using to grind this down is a 8x3 Norton coarse India that I have loaded very heavily with abrasive from a Norton Crystalline coarse. So what I do is literally I clean the surface of the India stone, oil it, and then take that coarse crystalline and like the back corner of it, like a flat, kind of like this, put it on the India and just scrub and load up that India stone with loose abrasive from the crystalline, and it actually does surprisingly well. I like using that. I've tried to use a couple different softer stones that I have, but the softer stones that I have tend to either be too soft to work with the point. It's a high risk of sort of dragging the point through, because you have to, again, even the primary grind is not consistent in that way. It's constant rolling. You have to be doing this the entire time. If you're doing a full, complete stroke, you're lifting it up like this, because your contact area is never a flat spot, which is part of why the finish is somewhat uneven. But yeah, when you get up to the point, there's such a low surface area relative to this other stuff that your risk of gouging the stone and sort of rounding out your point is pretty high. Whereas on the India stone, obviously it's a vitrified stone. It's essentially glass or clay, that sort of thing. So it's extremely hard, meaning that I don't have to worry about gouging it. So that's kind of a point there. But yeah, I think over the summer I'm just going to occasionally continue to work this down to a full zero. But other than that, it does seem to be pretty much directly in line with what I was looking for. It wasn't exactly cheap, but yeah. Now, the reason that I have it in this sheath, this is a case knives sheath. The reason that I have it in this is because the sheath that came with it badly dulls the edge, very badly dulls the edge. It's almost impossible to remove and reinsert the blade into this without running the main body of the blade against the sheath material, which dulls it very, very badly. It's not a minor or academic loss in sharpness. I mean, it's a large functional loss. So what I did when I first noticed that, shortly after getting the knife, what I did to check that, to see if it was indeed a functional loss in sharpness, as opposed to just me being a bit of a spaz and sort of a nerd about this kind of stuff. I had some cooked sausages, venison hot dogs actually, that were in the it's kind of like ring bologna. It's not lips and assholes type hot dogs, but it's pretty good stuff. But anyway, they're natural casings, and they were cooked. I'd cooked them the night before in my fridge. So what I did was, the section of the blade that was affected was from about here to here. Sort of that entire main body of the blade was very badly dulled, as far as I could tell. So what I did to check that, to see if it was a functional loss in sharpness, was take those sausages and use the undamaged portion of the tip and the heel of the blade to cut one, to make a few cuts, and then use the damaged portion to make a few cuts, and it was extremely easy to see a difference. What I was doing was, you apply a little bit of pressure just to where you can kind of see the tension build up in the case, the casing, and then draw. So you build up just, and I mean like a few ounces of force here. I'm not talking about leaning on it, just a few ounces of force to where you can see a bit of tension in the casing, and then draw the knife, start moving it. And in the case of the undamaged portion of the tip, as well as down here, the second that I started to move the blade, it fell right through the sausage. It went, very deep, almost all the way through, even with very minimal force. And that was consistent, where you made a few cuts, you just build up a little bit of tension, and as soon as the blade starts moving, it immediately starts falling through the material. And then I tried the same thing with this damaged portion, and you build up a little bit of tension, and it would just slide right across it. No aggression at all. Even with using like a 2 or 3 inch section of the edge, the same amount of force applied would cause nothing. It wouldn't cut through the casing at all with that level of force. So it was a major loss in sharpness. And I was quite disappointed, because from a functional standpoint, this is fairly sharp right now. I don't want to put it in here to actually demonstrate it, because I don't want to just ruin my edge. But the sheath itself was quite nice. I liked it. It was good and secure. I like these cold steel belt loops because they're large and soft, meaning that the knife will, hang straight when you're standing, and then if you're sitting or doing other things, it can kind of move around a little bit so it's not jamming up into your side. I kind of liked the sheath, and I was disappointed that it was such a problem. But what I ended up doing was ordering this from Knives Plus. The sheath was about $13-14, something like that. And then I paid for 2-day shipping, which was a bit more, but the all-up cost was about $23, $24, $25, something like that. And this sheath is leather welted, and I don't have any problems with it dulling the blade, and it actually fits almost perfectly in here. It's very if this came in black leather and had a cold steel symbol on here instead of the case XX, you might actually think that this was intended to carry this knife with, because it's a almost perfect fit. So in that sense, I'm quite happy that I have something that I can use with it now. So that solved that problem for now, but I also contacted Cold Steel via email, and I didn't go on some kind of a emotional rant where I was just swearing and making a scene and stuff, but I also didn't pull any punches, right? I basically said, the knife itself seems fine. I don't see any major issues with the knife. I love the design. It appears to be exactly what I was looking for in a hunting knife. But the sheath is terrible, and it's unacceptable to me to have to pay that much money for a knife, and fairly nice, well executed knife. It's by my observations so far, it appears to be very, very nice. So to have to pay that much money for a knife like that, and then have a sheath that ruins the functionality of the knife every time you use it, to me it's unacceptable. So I told them that, and after a very short exchange with the customer service dude, I was told a couple days later that he had forwarded my original email, which was a few paragraphs describing the problems, and how I kind of went into how, when you're talking about meat cutting, which is what this is going to be used for, it's a hunting knife. When you're talking about meat cutting, the most important aspect is extreme sharpness. You really need to have, that's what's going to get you your cutting ability, is extreme sharpness. It's not really, geometry doesn't really matter that much. You could probably use a Medford You could probably use a Medford to clean deer, and as long as it's sharp, you won't really see any problems with that heavy geometry. So extreme sharpness is what's necessary, and this sheath ruins the extreme sharpness every time you use it. Therefore, it ruins the utility of the knife. So he forwarded my original email to Lynn Thompson, and Lynn apparently decided, after reading it, to redesign the sheath and put me on the wait list as the first to get one. He asked for my address, and I was told that as soon as Lynn finishes the design on the sheath, that I will be getting one in the mail. I was quite impressed, because, like I said, it wasn't some sort of a terrible emotional rant where I was, swearing and saying that Cold Steel is the worst company to ever do this, and that. It wasn't really anything like that, but I definitely didn't sugarcoat anything. And I was fairly harshly critical of them to come out with a product like that has such a major flaw in it. And they didn't blame me. They didn't, write it off as some sort of a individual problem with the knife or whatever. They actually told me that the company president, the founder, is going to redesign the sheath. I found it to be quite surprising and quite pleasant. It's sort of a pleasant surprise. So that's that. And at the moment, I'm not really gonna, obviously I'm not gonna contact them and bug them about, oh hey, where's my sheath? Is it done yet? Because that's not really gonna. It's not really going to solve anything. I'm just going to assume at this point, at least from like an emotional perspective, I'm going to pretend that there is no, sheath coming in the mail, and just kind of, if one shows up in the mail someday, great. If not, whatever, I guess, because this works quite well at the moment anyway. So, yeah, that was the sheath issue. This is the knife that I'm using now. And I guess that's about it for now. So, yeah, I'll just leave it there, I guess, fellas. I'll probably make some other videos later in the day about this Fiskars, as well as this case knife that I have here. Those are a couple of my more recent acquisitions along with this. But yeah, I'll just kind of leave it there. Let me know if you guys have any more questions or anything like that.